Good afternoon, and welcome to the Spring 2026 University Chair Lecture. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. The University Chair Public Lecture Series gives us an opportunity to celebrate the work of our most distinguished faculty here at the Business School, whose scholarship deepens our understanding of how business can serve the common good. Today, we are especially pleased to recognize Professor Jim Otteson, the John T. Ryan Jr. Professor of Business Ethics, who will deliver a talk titled An Unplanned Journey. Named chairs, university endowed chairs, are among the highest honors a university can bestow on a faculty member. They recognize scholars whose work advances knowledge, forms students, and contributes to the common good. Three ideals central to our mission as a university. After the lecture, we will continue our conversation at a reception in the atrium just outside, and I hope that all of you will be able to join us there. Before we begin, I want to recognize a few special guests who are with us tonight. Of course, all of you are special guests, um, I want to do a special welcome for Jim's family. Um, Jim's wife, Katie, and their children, Victoria, James, Joseph, and George. Special welcome, apologies. Thank you for being here. I also want to welcome Michael Munger, the Edmund T. Pratt Jr. University Distinguished Professor at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. Professor Munger served as chair of political science at Duke for a decade and co-founded and directed the philosophy, politics, and economics program for 15 years. He's also a former colleague and mentor of Jim's. In a moment, he will do the formal introduction of Jim. So I'm the introduction to the introduction. So before he does actually introduce Jim, I want to share just a few words about the remarkable impact Jim has had here at Notre Dame. If you look at a resume, and especially if you look at Jim's resume, you see many, many very impressive accomplishments. Like all these books published in the top university presses, articles in top philosophy and ethics and other journals. And we all incredibly value that. And that's, of course, why we celebrate Jim today as well. At the same time, there's many things that Jim contributes to the university and especially to our students that are not easily gleaned off his resume. And that's what I want to emphasize here. A few words directly from our students about Jim's impact on our students here at Notre Dame. So first, a quote from one of our students, and I hope I don't say the name, too badly, from Grace Zucha, class of 2026. She writes, before taking Professor Otterson's course, I never considered that I could meaningfully integrate my faith into the pursuit of a business career, let alone understand my career as a true vocation. Through his teaching, he broadened my perspective on how individuals can contribute to the common good and to society as a whole. Next, a reflection from Molly Mendenhall, also from the class of 2026. She writes, in his course Why Business, Professor Otteson challenged me to think more deeply about what it means to be a businesswoman in a morally complex world. He encouraged me to engage fully with the material and apply it to my own life. He is a professor who truly cares about the well-being and future success of his students. And finally, a longer quote from a third student from the class of 2026, Jonah Tran. He says, Professor Otteson is a philosopher who does not just study fundamental questions about purpose, morality, and virtue, but actively applies them to the complexities of the business world. His unique approach to scholarship carries into his mentorship. He genuinely wants his students to lead lives of meaning and consistently goes out of his way to help them find that path. As you can hear in these reflections, Jim's influence extends far beyond the classroom. He challenges students to wrestle with some of the most important questions our students will face in their lives. What is business for? What responsibilities come with with the opportunity in business? How can our work contribute to human flourishing? What is the vocation of business? How can we grow in virtue through working in business by the grace of God and the support of others? Under Jim's guidance, students engage these questions with both intellectual rigor and moral seriousness. And for many of them, those questions become defining ones, especially defining for their time here at Notre Dame. Through his courses and his leadership of the Business Honors Program, Jim has helped cultivate a community of students who think deeply about the purpose of business and about the kinds of leaders they hope to become. So we're deeply grateful to you, Jim, for the many ways you enrich our college and the university and the way that you help shape the life of our students. And now, finally, it's my pleasure to invite Professor Michael Munger to the stage to formally introduce Jim. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Thanks so much. It's an honor to get to introduce Professor Otteson. I've known him for 20 years. I'm sure I don't know everything about him. So, to get a deeper appreciation of his contributions and work, I followed the zeitgeist and consulted AI. That's a darn good thing because otherwise I would have missed his 2021 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Oh, all right. Never mind. I guess old school is still the best school. Joseph Campbell, in his 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, describes a narrative structure he calls the hero's journey. This trope, this story of completion by separation, initiation, and return, can be found in narratives ranging from Gilgamesh to Odysseus to Bilbo Baggins. The hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered. A decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. Well, the young Otteson took his bachelor's degree from PLS here at Notre Dame, where he also won the Bird Award for the best senior thesis. Now, it is said of PLS folks that they can speak with great authority on literally any subject for 30 seconds. This is taken to be an insult, but I would double down on that. I myself did the humanities curriculum at Davidson College, and I would wear that as a badge of honor. PLS harks back to a previous time where there were clear expectations and obligations for an educated person. All PLS students are potential heroes. Now, it's at this point that Otteson's epic journey began. To paraphrase Adam Ferguson, it has been the result of Otteson action, but not the execution of any Otteson design. His journey, like all epic journeys, was unplanned. He earned his master's and PhD in philosophy at the University of Chicago, well known for its friendly, gentle, caring environment. His dissertation addressed my favorite philosophers, David Hume and Adam Smith, and was entitled The Unintended Order of Morality. He then began his heroic encounters with fabulous, often horrific forces at the University of Alabama, Georgetown, Yeshiva, NYU, and Wake Forest. He dealt with and disposed of other fabulous forces, including a frankly fantastic encounter with the Gorgons and Minotaurs of Dartmouth College. In 2020, he made his way back home, undaunted, but not unchanged. That's the point of the hero's return, actually. As Billy Joel put it, no, the place hasn't changed, and that's why I'm going to feel so strange. Otteson now stands at the center of Mendoza's laudable and serious efforts to unite business education with the moral and spiritual purposes proper to a Catholic university. Now, being a PLS man, Otteson's intellectual range is substantial, spanning business ethics, political economy, history of economic thought, and 18th century moral philosophy. But there's a coherence to this diversity. He's spent his career asking a consistent set of questions. What kind of creature is this human person? How are moral standards formed? What is the relation between liberty and virtue? Can commercial society ennoble rather than deform character? How? Can business be not merely tolerated, but can it be understood as a genuinely honorable human vocation? Now, Notre Dame's own profile of Otteson calls him the Adam Smith Professor. That title is not a journalistic flourish, it's actually a fair description of his standing. His most referenced book, and rightly so, is his magisterial Adam Smith's Marketplace of Life. Now, having myself just completed a 10-part, 22,000 word podcast on the wealth of nations, I have to admit that perhaps the most important single source for my work was his excellent follow up book, The Essential Adam Smith. That essential book should be required reading in all history of economic thought classes. Now, Otteson's work on Smith is important because it recovers the unity of Smith's thought, fleshing out the flattened caricature of Smith as the theorist of greed. I would summarize Otteson's approach to Smith as requiring that we take seriously both of Smith's two major axioms about the nature of human nature. First is that humans care about the welfare and good opinions of other humans. Second is that humans have a deep impulse to improve themselves through truck, barter, and exchange. From those two foundational axioms, Smith derives a prediction that unless prevented, society will evolve an emergent moral order based on propriety and a technological order that elaborates division of labor. Smith argues for a strong, though rebuttable presumption in favor of what he calls the system of natural liberty. Otteson's work matters because it restores a truth our age is always in danger of forgetting. The understanding of commercial society cannot be separated from moral philosophy. Smith accepts the classic moral intuition that true freedom is self command, a capacity to act with propriety in accord with fundamental justice. A market system composed of the sorts of morally impoverished solipsists, caricatured as Homo economicus in most economic classes, would collapse in theft and violence. Otteson's scholarship has been a sustained argument that questions of prosperity are inseparable from questions of virtue. Business ethics cannot be reduced to compliance, regulation, or public relations. It must ask what societal ends and what moral purposes business serves, what responsibilities it imposes, and what kind of soul it forms. These commitments are not one and dones. Otteson has continued to pursue these themes in his recent work. In Honorable Business, a framework for business in a just and humane society, he argues that commercial activity can be value in itself. Honorable businesses should create value for all parties, not merely seek gain unmoored, drifting from moral purpose. In his Notre Dame teaching and writing, he repeatedly frames the central question not as whether business must apologize for itself, but whether business can realize its potential to be a positive good, a genuine form of service to human flourishing. These are not peripheral questions at Notre Dame. In fact, they should be the central questions for any university that takes seriously both the intellect and the soul. His achievements in this broader field have been recognized in concrete ways. His book, Actual Ethics, won the 2007 Templeton Enterprise Award, and I actually checked. That's not AI, that's true. His course, Why Business, received the Aspen Institute's 2017 Ideas Worth Teaching National Award. He received the 2019 Distinguished Scholar Award from the Association of Private Enterprise Education and the 2025 Julian Simon Memorial Award. These honors reflect not only scholarly productivity, but intellectual leadership. He has helped create a language in which business education can speak of dignity, vocation, justice, and service without embarrassment. And this brings us full circle, the end of the hero's journey, Otteson's return to Notre Dame. Professor Otteson is not simply a distinguished scholar who happens to teach at a Catholic university. His work fits with what my long revered and now much missed Duke colleague Alistair McIntyre called the Catholic practice. Otteson engages students with Catholic social thought and moral philosophy in ways that are uncommon, or more accurately, unknown, at other major business schools. The business honors program he helped shape was designed not simply to identify high academic performers, but in keeping with Notre Dame's identity to encourage students to look inward and conceive of the authorship of their character as a central and lifelong entrepreneurial project. Like Adam Smith Otteson offers a positive, optimistic vision of human flourishing, or as Otteson always says, eudaimonia, that gives a strong moral authorization to the honest pursuit of opulence, provided it is done in the right way and for the right reasons. There's a direct line of organic development from Aristotle, the message of Christ and the apostles, and St. Thomas Aquinas that lead through Adam Smith to today. You are fortunate to call Jim Otteson your colleague. I am blessed to call him my friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor James R. Otteson.
Very much like, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Let me just put that down. Thank you very much, Professor Munger. Thank you very much, Martin Kremers, my dean, and thank you to all of you. I must say this is a little overwhelming. Thank you for taking time out of your day. I feel like we should just end now. Uh, some of the things I had hoped to talk for, thank you. Or I see Molly. Thank you very much for your comments from the students. That was all very unexpected. Thank you very much. I'm a little bit overwhelmed about all of this. This is a great honor for me, and I am truly thankful for the opportunity. I am well and truly blessed to be here, especially with my family here, which is fantastic. So many colleagues and friends. So I titled my remarks. Is it still a little too loud? It's good. An unplanned journey, as my dean, Martin Kremers, very helpfully pointed out. He said that's not a very informative title. Um, but I thought that this might be the only opportunity I have to give a talk like this. I have given many talks, but I don't usually talk about myself. And I don't really sit and have other people talk to me. Good to see you. So this is the title of my talk, and I thought maybe, can I move this? I'm going to trip on that. That maybe the best use of my time might be to tell you how I got here. And it is quite an unusual journey. There have been many interventions, including from quite unexpected sources, that could lead me to be at a place like this, doing what I'm doing. And so the question I would like to talk about is this: how did a person like me end up at a place like this? And so maybe the first way to begin is at the beginning of my academic journey, and here it is. That's me. Um, with my father and my half brother. So it's a bit grainy. I apologize about that because it was taken with something called film on something called a camera. Back in 1978, I was 8 years old at the time. And it's a little awkward there. So that's me on the left, and that's my father and my half brother, Jason. I had only just met my father. So my mother and father split up when I was a baby, and I didn't know him. I was living in Joliet, Illinois, which is a little bit outside of, hi, Grace, a little bit outside of Chicago. And I had just met him for the first time, and he decided, well, maybe it'd be good for us to spend a little time together. And so he said, why don't we go to Notre Dame? So we went on a driving trip to Notre Dame. And so this was my first time ever being on Notre Dame's campus. In fact, it was the first time I had ever been on any university campus. So nobody in my family had ever gone to college before. I had never been to a university or a college, never seen it before. I showed up at Notre Dame, and it's a little awkward. You can see I didn't really know the guy. I mean, he was my father, I guess, but I didn't really know him. So it was a bit of an awkward moment, but it had a very profound effect on me. So that's where it started. Where did it end? Well, here's how it's going. So here's me. That's when I was interviewing for this job that I have now. I was with Craig Crossland, who was giving me a tour of campus. And I didn't intend for that to be in exactly the same. I mean, that's just accidental how that happened. That was taken on an iPhone, which is why it's a much nicer picture. I do think it's a bit weird that in both cases, the Hesburgh Library looks like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Do you know that? I'm not really sure why that is. There were lots of stops between those two. And one of the things that I want to say about when I first visited Notre Dame was it had a very profound effect on me. Seeing this campus and it struck me, I was awestruck at how beautiful it was. Everybody seemed so smart, and I was sure they all spoke to each other in ancient languages. They carried books. And I made a resolution. So I was only 8 years old, but I made a resolution to myself. Actually, I made two resolutions. One resolution was I was going to be the first person in my family to go to college. I was going to. Second resolution, can you guess? I would be the first person in my family not just to go to college, but I was going to graduate from Notre Dame. And I remember very distinctly going home and telling my mother that I'd made these resolutions. And she said, "Oh, that's great, honey. It's great to have goals. And it's not easy to get into those schools. We'll see how it turns out." But I'm very proud and glad to announce I made both. Both of those dreams came true to me. So, as Professor Munger mentioned, I did come to Notre Dame. I majored in the program of liberal studies. I got the Otto Bird Award for the best senior thesis. The title of my thesis was "The Therapeutic Philosophy of Wittgenstein: An Overview." Suppose that's a PLSE type title. Yeah. Um, so I graduated from Notre Dame in 1990. Didn't really know what I was going to do. Being a professor was not something I was even considering. It wasn't even on the radar, but I had no real prospects. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe about going to law school, wasn't really sure. I'd applied to law schools and, whatever. I wasn't really excited. But one thing I did know for sure when I graduated was that I had fallen in love. I met a girl on a blind date in October of our freshman year, set up by her roommate and my roommate. And I realized, okay, I don't have any prospects. I don't really have any plans for the future. Who knows what it's going to be, but I'm going to ask that girl to marry me. So right after we graduated, I asked her to marry me, and thank God she said yes. There she is. Yeah. Okay. Good. Now she was taking a pretty big risk too because she was going into banking, with a future, and I was going to I don't know what I'm doing. So thank you for taking a risk on me. So we got married in the next year. I got a master's degree in philosophy because I wanted to see whether that was a thing for me, whether it would work out. That led me to the University of Chicago. So I entered the PhD program at the University of Chicago, became interested in the history of philosophy, in particular the history of modern philosophy. The modern period philosophers call that roughly, I think I've got the years there, 1600 to 1900, roughly Descartes to Nietzsche. That's the modern period of philosophy. But even more particularly, I became interested in this person, in David Hume. I loved reading David Hume. Everything I read from him, I thought more and more this guy had figured out all of the things that I was hoping to figure out. He'd already figured it out. So I loved reading David Hume. So I decided after taking my required courses, passing my comps, taking the language exams, I was going to write a dissertation on David Hume. But there were a lot of people already doing that. So there's a huge literature on David Hume. Many people were working on it, including in my department. So I was trying to think about what would be a new angle, something I could add that might be interesting or new. And I discovered as I was reading around that Hume was friends with somebody named Adam Smith. Hmm, that was interesting. Now, I didn't know much about Adam Smith. I had read in the program of liberal studies a little bit from The Wealth of Nations. I didn't really, with apologies to Professor Nagorski, I didn't remember a whole lot about it, maybe 30 seconds worth. I remembered the phrase invisible hand, but I didn't remember much else. But I decided that any friend of Hume's was a friend of mine. If Hume respected somebody, maybe it was worth my time. So I investigated a little bit. So I began reading around about Adam Smith, and I discovered that he wrote another book, not just the book called the much more famous one now, The Wealth of Nations, but he had written a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So I decided on a lark, I'll check it out of the library and read it. So I did. So I checked the book out of the library and decided to start reading. And once I started reading, I could not put it down. Over the next few days, I read it multiple times. I thought that book was so full of profound insights about human nature, about the human condition, about various deep aspects of human sociality. I was taken aback by that book. And I thought, oh, this is something worth spending some time thinking about. So I wanted to know what other philosophers were writing about it. So I raced to this was pre-Google days. You had to actually physically go to a library. So I physically went to the library to see what other people were writing about Adam Smith. And what do you think the philosophers were writing about Adam Smith? Yeah, nothing. Crates. Nothing. So who was talking about Adam Smith? Economists, economic historians, intellectual historians, various other people, but not philosophers. And I thought, this is an opportunity because that was such an awesome book. Philosophers aren't writing about it. This is an open frontier, and maybe I can be a pioneer. So I got very excited about this, and I decided I was going to write my dissertation about Adam Smith's moral philosophy, not his economics, the moral philosophy. And I got so excited about it, I raced over to my advisor's office, and maybe my exuberance was a little high. But I went to him and I said, found this book, want to write my dissertation on it. It's an open field. And he sort of said, okay, let's just slow down there, son. Slow down your roll. Take it easy. I have a couple pieces of advice. So this was Professor Dan Garber. He's now at Princeton. He was at Chicago at the time. And he said to me, okay, well, I have a couple pieces of advice for you. First of all, if you want to be a real scholar, a Chicago level scholar, there are a couple of things you're going to need to know. First thing is do not get married. Said if you get married, it's going to be too distracting. You won't be able to spend the months, years, and single minded dedication that's required to be a real scholar. And I said, oh, Professor Garber, I'm already married. He said, you are? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, okay, well, then whatever else you do, do not have any children. And I said, oh, actually, we already have a child. And he said, you do? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, okay, yeah, that's probably it for you. There's probably no chance. You will never be a great scholar. And he said, but you might be a lost cause. But the other and final piece of advice I, Dan Garber, have for you, young Jim Otteson, is whatever else you do, do not write on Adam Smith. So if you wonder why Professor Garber is not here introducing me, well, I was not his favorite student. I failed on all counts. I said, well, so I was very excited, and my level of excitement probably exceeded my actual knowledge of anything. But I was saying, but Adam Smith in this book, and nobody's writing about it all this afternoon. I was going on, and he said, fine, okay, all right, knock it off. He said, okay, you're obviously a lost cause. But I will give you permission to write on Adam Smith on two conditions. First condition is it can't only be on Adam Smith. It has to be on Adam Smith and David Hume. And I said, okay, great. What's the second condition? He said, the second condition is that there is no philosopher in the University of Chicago department who's an expert on Adam Smith. Maybe not an expert on Adam Smith in any of the top philosophy departments in America. So you're going to have to find an outside reader who's a bona fide scholar, Chicago level scholar, who is willing to vouch, first of all, that this is actually a topic that somebody can write a dissertation on. And second of all, if the answer to that is yes, we'll agree to be on your committee. I said, great. And I said, who would that be? And he recommended Knud Håkansson. Knud Håkansson, who was a Danish philosopher. He had written a book about Adam Smith and David Hume a few years earlier on jurisprudence. And he was at that time, just then, he was the general editor of the Cambridge History of 18th Century Philosophy. So I didn't know him, but Garber knew him. And so I said, great, I agreed to both of those. And he said, okay, he reached out to Hackinson. Hackinson said, yes, you can write a dissertation on Smith and I'll be a reader. Awesome. So I was off to the races to get started. Went home to my lovely bride and told her, hey, great news. I got my topic approved. And well, she had an announcement to make. The announcement was, we're expecting our second child. And I said, oh, praise God. That's awesome. Thank you so much. That would be my son, James. There he is. You want to yeah, there he is. And I said, she said, yeah, but that's the good news. And I said, what's the bad news? And she said, the bad news is I will not have a second child to someone who is still a student. Okay, so that meant I had a deadline. So I got to work. And in approximately 9 months later, I finished my dissertation. I met the deadline, got it done, got it finished, got it in. Sent it to Hackinson. Hackinson reviewed it, and this was his big comment. He said, "It's worthy of submission as is." And I said to Garber, "What does that mean?" And Garber said, "Means you're done. Get out of here. You got to be done." So I was done. I finished, and here I am. These are some pictures from my graduation from the University of Chicago. As you can see, if you look in the middle one, I was very happy. That was a big day. I was not only the first person to graduate from college, but the first person in my family to get a graduate degree and a PhD. I think my mother to this day still refers to me to other people only as Dr. Otteson, no matter what it is. A very proud thing. And that's my wife there in the upper left, and that's our daughter, Victoria. There she is. Yeah, that's Victoria, who was there. Very proud, happy day. Finished my dissertation. But then I had to go on the job market. That turned out not to be so fun. So I applied for a lot of jobs, didn't get a lot of interest. Weeks went by, months went by, more jobs, not a lot of interest. I started to think maybe Professor Garber had a point about nobody hiring anybody who wrote on Adam Smith. And then near the end of the cycle, basically when I was giving up hope and thinking, well, I'm going to have to get a job maybe in banking or something. I don't know, maybe go back to law school, do something else. I did finally I had a couple of offers for postdocs, but I finally got an offer for a tenure track job from a place that I didn't know much about, but it was a tenure track offer. And that was the University of Alabama. So I had never been to the state of Alabama before I went for my job talk. I didn't really know anything about it. That thing in the foreground, students, is a telephone. That was me in August of 1997, starting my job as an assistant professor of philosophy there. Some of you been in my office might recognize some of those books. Um, so I didn't know anything about the state of Alabama, but we packed up, moved from Chicago, moved the family to Alabama. And I started my job there. It was a tenure track job, which is the gold standard. Everybody wants a tenure track job, and it was a flagship. It was the state's flagship university. I told one of my other readers on my dissertation, Ted Cohen, that I got this job. I got a job finally, and he said, "Oh, great! Where'd you get a job?" I said, "The University of Alabama," and he said, "They have a philosophy department." Oh, yes. So I started. So what did I do when I got there? Well, I started publishing. That's what you do when you want to try to get tenure. I started publishing some journal articles. Um, and one of the things that I noticed and thought about when I was writing my dissertation, but didn't actually address, was this. So there was a long-standing problem in Adam Smith's scholarship. About 150 years before I was writing about this, so in the middle of the 19th century, some German scholars had thought that they discovered a problem with Adam Smith. Here's the problem in a nutshell. Smith only wrote two books. That's it. His entire career, only had two books. Probably wouldn't even get tenure in the business school with only two books. First book was called A Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759. Second book, Wealth of Nations, came out in 1776. First book was about morality. Second book was about markets. First book talked about something called human sympathy. Second book talked about self-interest. Are you starting to get the idea of what the problem is? So these German scholars decided that, well, the problem is those two books don't go together. And they offered something called the Umschwungstheorie, which is the sort of the reversal theory. So that here was the idea. Smith, as a young man, when he was idealistic and thought people actually cared about each other, he wrote this book about morality. And then he grew up a little bit, he had some experience in the world, traveled around Europe and other places, went to France, and everything goes south when you go to France. Everything went sour. He realized people don't actually care about each other. They only care about self-interest. So he wrote a second book, which is totally separate. That gave competing conceptions of human nature, competing conceptions of human motivation. And this became such a celebrated scholarly problem that it was actually given this name by the German scholars. It's a very grave sounding name, Das Adam Smith Problem. Well, so I decided to wade into this because I thought that when I was working on my dissertation, that I maybe had figured out a potential solution to this problem. And so I decided on the down low to start writing a book. I didn't tell anybody I was writing this book. I wanted to write a book about how these two works of Smith might go together. I didn't tell anybody that because I didn't know if I was going to be all wet. I was afraid that maybe I was getting it all wrong. There was nobody in the Department of Alabama who was a Smith scholar, so I didn't share my chapters with anyone. Um, but I worked out what I thought was a solution to the Adam Smith problem. Produced a 110,000 word manuscript. And well, what do I do with that? I had never written a book before. I don't know what to do. So I thought, well, I'm just going to send it to the top academic press in the world. And when they say no, I'll just send it to the next press. And when they say no, I'll just keep working my way down. So that was my strategy. So, what's the top press in the world? I decided it was Cambridge University Press. So, what I did was I printed out the book, put it in a box with a cover letter that said, "Dear editor, please consider the enclosed manuscript for publication with Cambridge University Press. Sincerely yours." That was it. Now, for those of you who are going to be writing books in the future, I don't recommend that as a strategy. I just sent it sight unseen. I had no idea who these people were. So I sent it out. About a month later, I got a note back from the editor that said, "Thanks for sending us this. Looks interesting. I'm going to send it out to reviewers." Oh, okay. Send it out to so that sounded like good news, but then I thought, "Oh, now this is where the rubber's really gonna hit the road because actual reviewers who know something are gonna decide," and I hadn't let anybody see any of the drafts of any of the book at all. A couple months later, I got the news, they accepted it. So it became my very first book, Adam Smith's Marketplace of Life. So Professor Munger talked a little bit about the book. I had thought that I would maybe give you about 30 minutes of the details of the argument. I won't do that. I will say how that is supposed to solve the Adam Smith problem. What I thought Smith was doing, and this is the argument of the book, was that he was actually giving, in the theory of moral sentiments, it was not a book of moralism telling you what's right and what's wrong, how to behave, how not to behave. It was more a book in what we might today call moral psychology, where he was trying to understand how it is that human beings come to have the moral sentiments they have. So here's the interesting thing that Smith noticed. All human beings, when they're born, have no moral sentiments whatsoever. So babies just scream out to have their desires satisfied. They have no sense of propriety or impropriety or when it's right to ask for things or when not to ask for things. They just have desires and wants, they want them satisfied. Yet by the time we become adults, we have a very sophisticated sense of moral sensibilities. Smith wanted to understand what effectuated that change. How do we go from amoralized infancy to highly moralized adulthood? So the account, the theory of moral sentiments that he gives, explains that. It gives a model to understand how exactly that happens. And the model incorporates something like what Smith thought was a Newtonian approach to human behavior. So Newton had united all kinds of disparate phenomena, both on the in Earth, motion of things on Earth, motion of things in the heavens, with a few rules and a couple of constants. That's what Smith was trying to do in the theory of moral sentiments. What are the constants? One of them is that he said we all desire mutual sympathy of sentiments. He thought this was just a fact. So there's that word sympathy that the German scholars were interested in. But by sympathy, Smith did not mean pity, and he didn't even mean empathy. What he meant was we desire to see our sentiments, whatever they are, echoed in other people. It gives us a great deal of pleasure when we see that other people join in with us in thinking the same kinds of things about the things that matter to us. By contrast, if we realize that other people around us have very different views about things that matter to us, that antipathy of sentiments gives us a great deal of displeasure. So that means that what we do, Smith thought, was we spend our lives looking for ways to behave, judge, act that will stand a chance of achieving mutual sympathy of sentiments, and then getting this great pleasure. And since we're all doing this at the same time, what happens is that both in the individual case and on the social case, standards emerge. So we begin to have habits of behavior. Those habits might turn into conventions. Those conventions might turn into rules or even principles. That happens on the individual level. And because we're doing this with everybody else, it happens on the social level as well. So the moral standards that we recognize are emergent social facts. They are the product of human behavior, but none of the human beings are intending to create them. It's a little bit like languages. So there are rules about pronunciation and grammar in every language. Where do those come from? How are they changed over time? They come from the people who are using the language. At any given time, there are rules that everybody recognizes. At the margins, there might be things that are in contest. Over time, things can change, but at any given time, the majority of things are pretty well set. That's what I thought Smith was, that's what I argued was Smith's approach to understanding human morality. But that same model could be applied to other large scale human social institutions. So, what I argued in the book was I called it a marketplace model. And what I argued in the book was that this was actually a model for him to understand all human, large scale human social institutions. So, not just morality, not just language, not just law, although they talked about law as well, also markets. Now, you see the connection between the two? So what I argue, I actually made this claim. What Smith was offering was a grand unification theory for human sociality. That's kind of a highfalutin claim, but I made that claim in the book, and I said he should be considered the founder of social science. He is the first person to apply Newtonian scientific approaches to the study of human behavior. He should be considered the father of human social science. But because that model that he was creating applies both to morality in the first book, economics in the second book, that is the solution to the Adam Smith problem. There were two different projects, or two different parts of the same project. So that's what I argued. Um, and I claim 150-year-old problem, I solved it. Yeah. That's my family. Thank you very much. Okay, so I won't talk about any of my other work in any detail like that. I wanted to give you thank you. I was still at Alabama at the time. Here are a couple of other milestones. Because of that book, they promoted me, gave me tenure. When it, Boy, that's very irritating. Pull it. You sure? Okay. I became a department chair, a rather young department chair. They made me an arts and sciences fellow. There's me as an arts and sciences fellow. And in 2007, they promoted me to full professor on the strength of my second book with Cambridge University Press. And I won't give you all the details about that, but I tried to develop a conception of personhood drawing on Kantian and Aristotelian elements, who are two figures that are not often seen together, but I thought there were elements of both of those that could be integrated in a certain way. And in that book, I tried to develop and defend a version of liberalism that flowed out of that conception of human personhood, and that was meant to be a differing way of defending liberalism from the then dominant and maybe still dominant Rawlsian view. And that's the one that Professor Munger mentioned. I won that award for. Okay, so wait a minute. Yep, there we are. So wrote that book, got it published. They promoted me to full professor, and I said, "Thank you so much. I'm out." I dipped um, because another opportunity came up. And this was at Yeshiva University in New York. So I had gone from Chicago to Alabama, from Alabama now to Manhattan. So a little bit of cultural shock going on with the family. Why would I take that position? I am not, was not Jewish. Yeshiva University is an Orthodox Jewish institution. So I'm not even, yeah. Why would I do that? Because they gave me an interesting challenge. They wondered if I could be the director of their undergraduate honors program. And I thought, "Oh, that might be interesting." They also, offered me a position as a full professor in both philosophy and economics. I would be tenured in a second discipline, economics. So I took it. I took the job, took the opportunity, and we moved the whole family to Manhattan. That building, by the way, is where my office was, looking down over the, right, so it's the north end of the Manhattan Island looking south, so I got to see the entire, beautiful island. It was beautiful. Um, what did I do while I was there? Well, more accidental things. I got contacted totally out of the blue by a guy named John Meadowcroft, who was a political theorist at King's College London. And he said, I didn't know him. He just reached out to me out of the blue and he said, "Hey, I've been named the general editor of this new series of works. Wondered if you might be willing to write a volume in it." And I said, "And what's the word? What is the series?" He said, "Well, it's called Major Conservative and Libertarian Thinkers." I said, "Okay, what is it you want me to write?" He said, "Well, why don't you write about Adam Smith?" I said, "But Adam Smith is neither a conservative nor a libertarian." And he said, "Well, but that's what everybody assumes." And I said, "Well, everybody's wrong." And he said, "That's why you need to write the book." I said, "Oh, okay." So, as maybe some of you can appreciate, certainly my dean can, I have a hard time saying no when somebody makes a good argument like that. So, I did. So, I wrote another book on Adam Smith, even though I had no intention to do so, laying out the case for what his place in the history of political economic thought was and why he was properly considered a liberal and not neither a conservative nor a libertarian. Um, while right after that book came out, and while I was, no, as while I was finishing the book, I was at a conference and I happened to run into the editor from Cambridge that I'd worked on with those previous two books, and she said, "Hello, good to see you. What are you working on?" And we were talking about various things, and the conversation turned. I told her that I was trying to write this essay that I wasn't getting very far on about this book that had come out by somebody named G.A. Cohen. Title of the book is "Why Not Socialism?" with a question mark. So G.A. Cohen had been a distinguished professor of philosophy at Oxford for many years, a lifelong defender of socialism. This book came out, and I was very excited to read the book because it turned out it was his last book. He passed away after writing it. And I thought this would be sort of the strongest statement, the definitive statement of his view. And I read it and I was disappointed, as I told her, because the arguments aren't really that good. So my students who haven't read that book yet, revealing a little bit about I said the arguments just aren't that good. And so I was writing this essay, but it's not very much fun poking holes in bad arguments. And she said, and we talked about it, and I kind of offhandedly said, "You know what somebody should do? Somebody should write a book that makes the best possible case for socialism, both economically and morally, and then assess that. That would be an interesting book." And she said, "You are so right. You need to write that book." And I said, "Oh, okay." So I did. That's this book. So a chance conversation led me to write this book in which I make what I think is the strongest case for socialism. Special thanks to G.A. Cohen. And I show or argue that liberalism is still superior even to the strongest case that can be made for socialism. One little note about the title of that book. That was not my title. My book's title when I sent her the manuscript was Liberalism and Socialism, a comparative economic and moral analysis of competing systems of political economy. Much more informative title, wouldn't you say? So she sent it to reviewers, and reviewers got positive reviews. And she said, "Okay, I think we're going to publish a book, but with one problem: we're not going with that title." And I said, "What's wrong with that title?" She says, "It's terrible." And I said, "But it's fully informative of the content of the book." And she said, "Spoken like an academic." No, she said, "Let's try the end of socialism." I said, "The end of socialism?" She said, "End in the sense of telos, the direction in which socialism would go." I said, "Yeah, I guess. But, if you put that as the title of the book, people are going to buy it thinking I'm making some kind of a prediction about, I don't know, the astrological date on which socialism is going to end or something." And she said, "Exactly. People will buy it." As such. So I said, "Okay, under no circumstances am I going to allow any of my work to be involved in any kind of manipulative deception like that." And so that was the title of the book. Yeah. While I was at yeshiva, I was teaching my courses, doing other things. I had a weird little unexpected intervention. I got a phone call from the director of graduate studies at NYU, in the PhD program in the economics department at NYU. Very distinguished department with Nobel laureates. He called me up and he said, "Hi." I didn't know him. He said, "We have this course on our books called that Political Economy of Welfare, Justice, and Ethics. It's supposed to be a PhD seminar." He said, "We don't have anybody who will teach it. None of our faculty are willing to teach it. They're all more quantitative oriented. Nobody wants to teach it. It's on the books. We feel like we should offer it. So I looked around and I found you, and I think you'd be the guy to teach it. Would you be willing to teach it?" And I said, I don't know, maybe. Seems like a kind of interesting topic." And he said, and I thought, well, I started thinking about what I might teach in a course like that. And I said, "Yeah, let's do it. I'll do it." And he said, "Great. Okay. But just to warn you, you probably will not get very many students, maybe 3 or 4 students, because our students, our PhD students, D students are also very quantitatively oriented. They're not really going to be interested in this." And I said, "That's fine. Even if it's just a couple students, I will be interested in figuring out what to teach in a course like that. And working through those works, even with a few students. So great." So scheduled the course. They gave me this little 12-person seminar room, and I walked into the room. There were 19 people in the room, standing room only. I said, what's going on?" Well, about half of them were auditing the course, and they asked me, "Please don't tell my advisor that I'm taking this course because I don't want my advisor to know that I'm interested in any of this. Your secret's safe with me." We had a fantastic course. I loved that course. We had the best discussions about things. So these were the PhD students in economics at NYU. We'd read Smith and Hume and Marx and all kinds of interesting things. Loved that course. The director of graduate studies said, where they're all sort of shocked at how much interest there was. He said, maybe we can have a more regular arrangement. You might teach this every year, or maybe even have talk about a more permanent arrangement with NYU. And I said, that sounds very interesting. I think I'll leave. So I left again. Chicago, Alabama, New York, North Carolina. So I went to Wake Forest University in North Carolina for what I assumed would be the last stop of my career. And that's maybe kind of what I almost sort of quasi promised to my wife, that we would not leave again. This would be it. Why did I go there? The reason is it offered another challenge that I thought would be interesting. And that's this: I had taught introduction to ethics, history of moral philosophy, history of ancient moral philosophy, modern moral philosophy. I had taught bioethics, all kinds of applied ethics, but never business ethics and never in a business school. And I thought that might be interesting. And maybe I could use some of the ideas that I worked on for that NYU course to do this. So I did. I took that opportunity, convinced us to leave again. Thank you to my children who all decided to go with me. Yeah. And while I was there, I created a new course from scratch, and I called it Why Business. Raise your hand if you've heard of that course before. Yes. So I called it Why Business. After I taught it for a couple of terms, I also put together a collection of the readings that I used in that course. Um, Raise your hand if you know that book. Yeah, thank you very much. I have all the students raising their hands. But I do want to say something else about that course, if you'll just indulge me for a second. So I started thinking about it there at Wake Forest. Before I taught a business ethics course, I decided I should look at what other people were teaching in these courses, business ethics courses. And so I did a sort of non-systematic survey, but I looked at a couple dozen syllabi from famous people at famous institutions, and I found that many of the courses, not all of them, but many of them fell into one or the other of these sort of categories. They leaned into these categories. So some courses were more compliance based, talking about the legal or regulatory environments in which business must operate. As one famous endowed professor at another institution told me, he said, what I want students to come away from my course is with this formula: business ethics equals legal plus nice. Okay. All right. Um, Then there were more empirical approaches to organizational behavior. So, for example, things like looking at different kinds of corporate policies and seeing what kinds of results these policies have for employee recruiting, employee retention, employee satisfaction. That was more the empirical organizational behavior. And then there was another kind of category where courses sort of leaned into looking at bad actors in business, bad actors, bad businesses, and sometimes taking deep dives into case studies. Think of Enron and Bernie Madoff, et cetera. So what I was trying to do is figure out what would my comparative advantage be? What could I add to this? Well, given my own training, so I'm not a lawyer. I knew a little bit of or I had come to learn a little bit of the organizational behavior literature, but that was not my training, wasn't my specialty. So what would I do? Well, first of all, if I taught a course, it was going to have to be normative. So we're going to do not just moral principles, but meta ethical principles, maybe with a special emphasis on virtue ethics because I really like virtue ethics. But look at that third one. I decided maybe we could flip the script. Instead of looking at the ways that business could go wrong, we could maybe ask the question: is there some way that business could go right? What would it mean to engage in business in such a way that one could be justifiably proud of what one does? And maybe that could be a kind of aspiration. So, for business students who are thinking about dedicating their lives to business, maybe they could have a model in mind of what kind of behavior, what kind of activity in business might be something to aspire to do. In other words, we might ask, is there such a thing as honorable business? If so, what is it? How is it distinguished from dishonorable business? And what would be the institutional structures? So that's how I framed the course. After teaching that course a little bit and thinking about it, I decided what I really needed to do was to give my own answer to those questions. And so that is the book, Honorable Business. I published that with Oxford University Press. I went with Oxford instead of Cambridge, largely because I had thought that Cambridge was the number one press in the world. One of my colleagues said, well, maybe Oxford is. And so just to cover my bases, I decided to try Oxford as well. You'll see that Professor Munger gave me a nice blurb. That was one of the many ways in which he benefited my career. Thank you, Professor Munger. But the subtitle was important to me too. Look at the subtitle. It's not just honorable business, but a framework for business in a just and humane society. So that required me to say something about what a just and humane society is, what honorable business would be in such a society. But because we are fallen creatures in an imperfect world, we will never likely actually have a fully just and humane society. So I also had to think hard about what honorable business could be in a world of second bests, in a fallen world. Okay, well, I was teaching that course, published that book, and that led to an unexpected opportunity. You get three guesses what it is, only the first one counts. I got a call from my alma mater. That brings me here. So we got contacted by the University of Notre Dame, where I could take the position that I currently have as John T. Ryan, Junior Professor of Business Ethics, tenured now in a third discipline. It was not the best conversation I had with my family when I said, uh, when I proposed that we would leave beautiful North Carolina for less beautiful South Bend, Indiana. But it is Notre Dame after all. So we decided to come. But the real thing that this meant to me, not just coming back to my beloved alma mater, which I do love, was that I could do a Notre Dame version of my Why Business course. And indulge me for just a second. What do I mean by that? So I added Catholic social thought, but it wasn't just an add-on. It wasn't just an additional thing to think about. For me, it could supply the missing piece. There was always a missing piece when I taught that course at Wake Forest. What was the missing piece? It was an answer to the ultimate why question. So when I would talk about virtuous business or virtue in business or honorable business, I would always have that very sharp student who would say something like, why should I care about being virtuous? Well, because you should. That's not much of an argument. And if the argument changed to something like, well, if you behave virtuously in business, then you'll actually be more successful in business, which may be true. Then you would have the sharp student who would say, oh, so being virtuous itself doesn't matter. It's just what it gets me. So why can't I just act as if I'm virtuous or maybe pretend to people that I'm a nice person who actually cares about their interests as long as that gets me what I want? And if that means that I have to act virtuously or pretend that I'm virtuous, is that good enough? So these are sort of the ring of Gyges, if you know that from Plato's Republic, or what I call the calculated duping problems. Why can't I just, act as if so that I can get something else? But those are both ways of reducing the rules of morality or the principles of morality to what I call contingent rational strategies. They're just strategies. I have something I want. I'm going to try to get it. And the way I behave in order to get what I want is going to change given times, fashions, etc. That's a difficult problem to address. This is what Catholic social thought does for the course. It enables me to provide to students, here is one completed answer. What you get from Catholic social thought is a completed ontology. You see exactly where human beings are located in the great chain of being from God on down. And what follows from that is exactly the proper human anthropology. What follows out of that is what are the proper ways for human beings to behave and engage with one another? What are the proper ways to think about human institutions? Now, this isn't the only way to address it, but it is one venerable and I think compelling way to think about the proper way a human being should behave, not just in business, but in any aspect of their life. And it gives a way of understanding a complete answer. So students can see what a complete answer to this question might look like. So that was very big for me. Now, I can see Senior Associate Dean Ken Kelly over there squirming in his chair looking at his watch. Yeah, yeah. Hey, thank you for your patience with me. This is only my only shot, so I feel like I should just keep talking, but I won't do that. So I won't talk. This is some more work that I've done in more recent years. Yet another book about Adam Smith. That's the one that Professor Munger mentioned. The Economic Seven Dead. I finally wrote a book about David Hume. First thing I actually published about David Hume came out in 2021. The Seven Deadly Economic Sins book, that was the first work of mine that was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal, and got a favorable review in the Wall Street Journal. I also, with a co-author, wrote a book about whether wealth should be redistributed, and we talked about the strongest arguments in favor and against. And can you see who wrote the foreword for that? Thank you again, Professor Munger. I think he ended his forward with saying something with some words like, This is an interesting book. Thanks. Woo. All right. Interesting book. Appreciate that. Should have paid more. Okay. So I thank you for your patience with me and for indulging me in all of this. And it really is an be here with you. What am I doing now? So if I look back over the course of my career, I've had my work translated into many subjects. I've given many talks. I've taught over 40 different courses. I've graded approximately 25,000 student papers. Since 2020, so since coming to Notre Dame, published some books, some articles, and I am honored to serve as the director of the Business Honors Program, which really is a blessing for me. And since 2020, I also have 3 grandchildren. Thank you to my daughter, Victoria. Thank you. I hope there are many more coming. So get to work. You got more. I want more, and all the rest of you too. Um, what am I doing now? You may not be surprised to know that I'm working on another book. This one I'm going to write about human dignity, and I won't give you the elevator pitch. But if you stick around for the reception, I'd be happy to tell you the topic of that book. About 60% done. I'm taking a mini sabbatical, which the dean has not yet approved, but I'm sure he will since I'm going to say it publicly. I'm going to take about a month this summer to leave and go somewhere else and work on finishing that book. Yeah, okay. But let me come to my conclusion. If there is a lesson that I would draw from this, those of you who know me, and especially those of you who know me well, might know that I like to have a plan for things. I like to be strategic about things. I like to have a plan A, and if that doesn't work out, I have a plan B, and I've got a plan C. Well, if there's any lesson from my own career, I think it's that man proposes and God disposes. Um, what I've learned is that I don't always know what kinds of opportunities will be available. But if there is a lesson, I would say be open to those opportunities. Be willing to take a risk. Something new, different, interesting comes along your way. Don't be afraid to say yes. I might also mention, you might have thought looking at all of this that I have the academic equivalent of ADHD. If you notice, it's like I have a 5 to 7 year shelf life at each institution. Yeah, I've been here 6 years now. No, 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 no. But what I would say is, and with special thanks to my family, my friends, my colleagues, and all of my students, I think maybe I have actually found my way home. And so with that, I will say special thank you to my family who've loved and supported me throughout all of these years. It has meant the world to me, to my colleagues, my friends, and my students. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So before you head out to the social, Jen, first of all, great talk. But we have a special surprise, which is a student from the first cohort of the Business Science program, Josh Haskell, who's going to share just a brief reflection about his time here and you. And also, Josh, you get a social out there, so make sure you're so, please, Josh.
All right, this is all, so I'm gonna have to project. My name is Josh Haskell. I'm the 2024 graduate of Notre Dame and a member of the first business honoring program cohort. And Crystal Bozer, the program manager of the VHP Athlete Say a Few Words, just about my experience and how Professor Ox's leadership has impacted me. So this is a great honor and a very difficult act to follow. So I'm not expecting a standing ovation, no DQS hours, student law here. I first had a conversation with Professor Otteson when I applied to the program and then withdrew my application. It was a brand new program and I was a brand new freshman. I was very uncertain about what that might look like. I already felt overwhelmed, and so I sent an email and said, thank you so much for accepting me. I'm going to withdraw my applications. It's just a locker here, So I sent that email and received one back from Professor Otteson that said, that's great. Would you come to my office and talk to me about it? So I did. And I went determined that I was going to just be checking a box and having a play and exit out of this program. And 45 minutes later, I left sure that I needed to join this program. So if that says anything about Professor Otteson's efficiency in sales, then I don't know what. But it was less about what he said and more about the time that he spent on me. And I wish that the slide 2 slides ago was up because it shows how much he has on his plate and how many dozens of other things he could have been spending his time on. But he chose to call him the lost sheep. That was me, his most disengaged member, to Steve with him, and I could not be more grateful that he did. The BHP has absolutely formed my life. It has been an excellent community and completely reshaped how I viewed my future. Ultimately, maybe the decision to not pursue my original plans in New York City, but to stay in South Bend and start a nonprofit addressing addiction relief. And recently, my best friend, who I also met through the BHP, Brendan McMahon, just left McKinsey Consulting to join me as a co-founder. So we have our first BHP startup thanks to Professor Otteson's leadership. So I could not be more happy with that decision and grateful to this program and for that original time that you spent on me and all the hours after that. And it is a real honor to say thank you, all students, Professor Otteson.